Welcome to Tax Problems Explained from the perspective of an attorney, a CPA, and a former IRS agent.
Welcome to Tax Problems Explained from the perspective of an attorney, a CPA, and a former IRS agent, all together in one, with Lawrence T. Ullmann. With decades of experience inside the IRS and in private practice, Lawrence helps individuals and businesses understand how the tax system really works and how to solve serious tax issues. I'm LeAnn Lyon, and today we are talking about IRS penalties, when they may be reduced or removed, and what factors the IRS considers in making those decisions. Hello, Lawrence. It's good to see you again.
Hi, LeAnn. Good to see you too.
So, Lawrence, when somebody owes taxes to the IRS, what types of penalties are most commonly involved?
Well, the two primary ones would be normally failure to file and failure to pay. But there can be others. There can be negligence. There can be fraud, civil fraud. So there are a multitude of penalties, but normally it has to do with a taxpayer who hasn't filed a tax return or who hasn't paid, or a combination of both.
So what are some of the reasons that the IRS imposes penalties in the first place?
Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, it is to help taxpayers make sure that they file in the first place and meet their filing responsibilities. Also, it's to dissuade taxpayers from not reporting all the income or over-reporting deductions, things of that nature, what we'd call negligence behavior. So there are a lot of reasons, but primarily it's to ensure that our tax system is being voluntarily complied with by taxpayers.
So are there circumstances where the IRS will reduce or remove penalties?
There are circumstances, and it really depends. There are several different reasons why, if you have a penalty, you may be able to have that penalty abated. The first reason, which isn't that well known by either the tax-paying public or professionals, is called a first-time abatement. These are procedures that are within the Internal Revenue Service, where if a taxpayer has not had any problems and had a clean record leading up to a particular tax period or tax return where there's a penalty abated, there's justification to abate it for the first time, sort of like giving somebody the opportunity to say, well, you've gotten one abatement, but this isn't going to happen again. Normally, though, the reason that you would normally try to get a penalty abated would be due to reasonable cause.
So what factors does the IRS consider when deciding to reduce or remove penalties? What are those causes?
Well, in something like reasonable cause, and which most penalties have the ability to abate if there is reasonable cause. If the taxpayer had a problem, let's say there was a medical emergency, the taxpayer, there was a death in the family, taxpayers going through a very messy divorce. These are reasons where a taxpayer may not file a return timely or not make a payment timely. And assuming the taxpayer is able to convince the Internal Revenue Service of the reasonableness of their cause, the IRS can abate penalties. Also, the taxpayer, if he relied, let's say, on written advice which was faulty from the IRS, normally the penalties can be abated. And there's another reason, if a taxpayer hires a CPA or a return preparer to prepare the returns and relies upon that preparer and the preparer does something wrong, the taxpayer can argue, I did everything that an ordinary, prudent business person would do in relying on this particular tax expert, and he made a mistake, and I understand that I'm responsible for the tax, but I shouldn't be held responsible for a penalty.
The IRS often looks at whether there was a valid reason for the issue. So, how does that factor into whether the penalties may be reduced?
Well, it sort of same thing as with reasonable cause. There are reasons why a taxpayer maybe files a return late or what have you. Now, if the taxpayer just procrastinates or the taxpayer said, geez, I forgot to do it, that's not going to be a good enough reason to get out of a penalty. But again, if the taxpayer had problems that a reasonable person would look at and say, oh, under those circumstances, maybe even I wouldn't have been able to prepare the return on time or make the payment on time, the IRS will definitely look at those circumstances and make a determination which could result in an abatement of the tax, of the penalty.
Are there other situations where penalties generally cannot be reduced? Such, you gave the example of, oh, I forgot. But what if somebody really is trying to resolve the situation?
Well, again, it really depends. If, let's say, the taxpayer had a very sloppy set of books and records, and that resulted in problems with filing the return on time. Normally, that's not going to be a reason that's reasonable to the Internal Revenue Service because the taxpayer didn't have to have a sloppy set of books and records. He chose to, or he was negligent in having a correct set of books and records. Same thing with receipts and documentation. If the taxpayer doesn't keep receipts, doesn't have journals and files that show what he or she did, how much they spent, that sort of thing, these are not going to be reasons that are going to result in an abatement of taxes, penalties.
Can you walk through a general example of a case where penalties were reduced or removed, and what made that possible?
Well, if a taxpayer, for instance, comes to me and the taxpayer says, look, I had problems trying to put together my tax return because right before the due date, there was a flood in my basement and some of my records were damaged or destroyed, and it took time to reconstruct what happened. Normally, if I'm dealing with the IRS and I can explain that and I can document that it actually happened, that it's not just a story, that's going to go a long way toward the abatement of the penalty, especially if the taxpayer tried very quickly to reconstruct these documents so that the return isn't filed like 2 years after it should have been, but maybe only a month after. So it's things like that that a reasonable person would look at and say, this isn't the type of situation that a penalty should be applied to, so we're going to abate it.
Okay, so the time since it should have happened also plays into the decision to abate or not.
Oh, not only the time spent, but if there are multiple years, in other words, if this is a one-off and the taxpayer has had a really good record of filing timely up till then, that's one thing. If for the last 3 years the taxpayer filed a return that was delinquent, then that's not going to be a reason that's going to result in an abatement of the penalty.
Perfect. So what tends to happen when someone assumes penalties will automatically be reduced without taking the proper steps?
What normally happens is that person is going to be very disappointed because the Internal Revenue Service is not going to just abate tax penalties and things of that nature on their own. And if the taxpayer doesn't even take enough care and effort to respond to notices or letters from the IRS that say there's a problem, the taxpayer's not going to get much in the way of sympathy for abatement of penalties.
So, as you wrap up today's episode, what should someone take into account before deciding how to approach a penalty issue with the IRS?
Well, the first thing is to decide what the penalty is. If it's a failure to file penalty, that's one thing. If it's a civil fraud penalty, that's much more serious. If it's failure to pay, that also can be serious. So you have to first determine what exactly is the penalty that I'm trying to get abated and what's the issue that gave rise to it. Secondly, the taxpayer should try to find out, either him or herself or through a professional, if they may qualify for a first-time abatement, or if they have reasonable cause. And if they feel they have reasonable cause, what sort of documentation can they use to be able to establish that? Thirdly would be the size of the penalty. I mean, I deal sometimes with penalties that go into the millions of dollars. This is not something that you want, if you're the taxpayer, to try to handle yourself, because you get one chance to make a good impression. And if you blow it before the professional gets involved, you may wind up not being able to get the penalty abated. So all of these factors and many more should be considered when someone is deciding how to handle and deal with an abatement of penalty problem.
Well, that is it for today's episode of Tax Problems Explained from the perspective of an attorney, a CPA, and a former IRS agent. If you are dealing with IRS penalties and want to understand whether they may be reduced, you can visit lawrencetulman.com. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you catch every episode. Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you, LeAnn. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.